welcome for everyone. So my name is Xavier Dominguez. I'm a program manager on the Identity Engineering Division on the Customer and Partner Success team. And I'm here with Stefan, which is going to help me to go through this content around secure hybrid access and how you can use Azure AD to protect your legacy applications. So let's go to do a quick intro first about Azure AD, and then we'll jump into the challenges of WAM and how we can help. So first, I think that probably this concept is already familiar for many of you, which is security controls or frameworks are evolving into using the identity as a control plane, the way to secure access not only to your employees, but also to partners and customers, and do that for the new and modern applications, but at the same time, try to leverage the same technology to protect and secure access to those on-premise apps. And as you do that, then apply adaptive access controls that enable you to verify signals, for example, based on the devices, based on the type of app that you're trying to access, the location of the user, and so on. So that's how Azure AD can help. And Azure AD is basically that control plane that will help to secure all kinds of apps, not just the SaaS applications, but also as well the on-premise or legacy ones. Now let's going to talk about how Azure AD can actually help using 4 concrete use cases. The first one is that Azure AD should be the place in where you can connect any of your workforce applications. As I mentioned already, by nature, Azure AD is basically the IDP for Office 365. By nature, due to the protocols that Azure AD supports, we can connect pretty much any SaaS application. But the idea is that users should benefit from a single sign-on experience in where they just have a set of credentials that they use to access either modern applications, but as well legacy applications, that there is no need to prompt again for a user and password input, not only because it's inconvenient for the users, but also because it also leads to potential security risk, right? So users might be used to be prompted for user credentials, which means that phishing attempts actually will be more successful. So Azure AD, when properly used and when connected to all apps, is going to enable this experience of being able to log into every single app, just type your credentials once, and then get access. Then the second one is about how you protect that access, right? So it's not that I just want to enable single sign-on. Then the idea is that as access happens, as I move between apps, as I try to access a new application, then conditions and controls are evaluated. Conditions are evaluated and controls are enforced based on the characteristics of the session, what type of device the user is coming from, what application the user is actually accessing, what type of information the user is accessing, or even what kind of action the user is attempting. So that's what in some cases is known as adaptive access. But protecting and governing access is actually more than that. We could be talking here about, for example, access reviews, how frequently you can actually enforce reviews to confirm that certain users still require access to apps, and you can involve reviewers to be part of that decision, for example, the managers. Or also, you can enforce governance controls via entitlements or access packages, in where is actually easier for users to request access to applications based on the needs of their work, but also to have automated processes that are going to assign access to apps or information based on what department the user works, to what manager that person reports, and so on. Then the third one is customers and partners. Historically, we had an issue, which is that we have been owning the credentials of those customers and partners that also need to access my corporate applications. The idea is that Azure AD should help also as well to make sure that you don't need to do that anymore, that you just care about authorization, that there is this concept or notion of bring your own identity, where partners can actually log in using their corporate credentials back in their IDPs. And then once that happens, again, you apply adaptive access, and also all the governance, all the features that I mentioned are as well as available. So it is that I don't care about the user identity itself, like controlling the profile or the password. And instead, what I care is about how I'm going to authorize that partner or that customer to access my information. And then lastly, accelerate the adoption of all application. And this is more related to how organizations are building line of business applications. So the idea here is that by adopting standards, by adopting libraries and frameworks that we're going to discuss later on, for organizations should be relatively easy to actually not only make sure that they fit into standards that are going to enable what I just described, but also that turnout times in terms of releasing those applications into production is going to be quick, because there's a lot of work around authorization and authentication that actually doesn't need to happen. That is already implemented on the platform, in this case, Azure AD. So let's going to jump into one of the core elements of Azure AD, which is actually security. And security in Azure AD basically is the fundamental of how zero trust is enforced. As I mentioned, adaptive access basically means that you should check for conditions, and there's a set of conditions that you could be looking for. Here we have just a sample of those conditions, but if we summarize the conditions, then basically it's about the who, right? So who is the user? What role the user has? Is a partner? Is an employee? From what IDP is coming? And then there is the notion of devices. Is this user coming from a well-known device or not? Is the user coming from a trusted device or not? And trusted device, actually, probably is better to rephrase it as compliant device, right? And then actually, lastly, is trusted, because a device can be compliant because it's following corporate policies, but that doesn't mean that it's trusted, because the device might be already compromised and might be showing some evidence of abnormal behavior, right? Then physical location or network location. Even when I mentioned at the beginning that security controls are evolving to be identity-centric versus network-centric, which was what was happened before, still organizations have policies around how information should be accessed from inside of the corporate network or from outside of the corporate network. And when companies have multiple locations or are worldwide operated or operate worldwide, then looking for patterns around how users access from what locations is actually super important. Then finally, another type of condition that we can check is a user coming from a client application, is a user coming from a browser? And then based on all these conditions, which until now probably have been all of them static, then the idea is to add an additional level of complexity in quotes, because it's not to you, is the idea is that we should also assign policies that are based on machine learning and AI that dynamically also assign a risk factor to that session or to that user or to that device in order to actually take the determination of what control should apply. So if I use a network as an example, it is easy to create a policy that says inside of a corporate network or outside of the corporate network. It's not the same to create a policy that says, oh, I want to look for abnormal locations. I want to look for impossible travel, for example, atypical locations. That's the concept here. Leverage a lot of the signals that our platform that process billions of authentications per day actually has, in order to determine what is or how risky is a session, how risky is a user, and how risky is a device. And in that case, apply controls that could be used for, as I mentioned, any cloud application, but as well on-premise applications. And you have there a sample of the controls, which it all starts with the allow or disallow, which are the basic ones. But there are some additional advanced controls like resetting a password because the user is risky, or for example, limiting access, which basically means limiting what users can do inside of the application. Enforcing a step up, like are you trying to do something inside of the app that should require to do MFA, or basically blocking legacy protocols, which are deemed to be insecure right now. All right, so being said that, what numbers are supporting the need to actually modernize the way that you access applications? There are a few of them, and these are actually not that new, right? So when you look at the recent breaches, security breaches in the market, 81% of them have been generated because of credential theft, right? So the way that the attack vector was initiated might be different, phishing, but at the end, the ultimate attack happened because there was a credential that was breached, either because they were able to compromise the password, or because that user, for example, had elevated permissions or elevated rights in a permanent fashion. So as soon as you can compromise that account, or you can lead the user to provide you with a credential, for example, via a phishing campaign, then you have all the appropriate permissions to then navigate laterally, or elevate yourself into upper access or more restrictive access that will give you access to information or sensitive information. The other big issue here is passwords, right? I referenced to this at the beginning, which is users are a little bit tired of typing users and passwords, and I think that we have made this more complex for users with password complexity policies and so on. So the resulting thing is 73% of the passwords out there are duplicate. And it's not like potentially you or me or many that actually define a different password per system and keep a vault. Users typically don't do that, right? So it is very easy for a hacker to actually try to guess passwords because of that very same reason. As soon as I can compromise one platform, like any platform, then I might be able to replay that password in other systems, and likely I will be able to actually get access into the account because users are going to repeat password. And the one that actually leads us to the conversation that we're having today as well is that 60 or 80%, or between 60 and 80% of the applications that organizations are still using are legacy in nature. And when we say that they are legacy in nature, that doesn't mean necessarily that they are actually on-prem, because they could also be living on the cloud. Basically, we're talking about the fact that they're using legacy of or legacy authorization technologies. And here we might be talking about mission-critical applications, ERPs like SAP, Oracle, HR systems, custom in-house made applications that were built a long time ago. Actually, I've been involved in several customer conversations in where actually not even the developers of those apps are any longer on the organization, and the organization is just waiting to see how they can be modernized or replaced, right? So it is not easy to even talk about how to modernize them, because there is no one who is actually familiar with the code of the app and will actually be able to do that in a transparent way. So many of these applications might be using Kerberos integrated authentication or Kerberos authentication, which is also what we call Windows integrated auth. Some applications might be accessible via RDP, but also a big portion of these apps are actually using what we call web access management technologies, which, to summarize what it means, is basically that you use HTTP, the protocol, as a way to reply back to the app with headers that are going to uniquely identify users, right? So basically the app is waiting for another platform to perform the authentication. In this case, there are many products that actually do that. And then once that happens, then that system, what it does is just reply with cookies and headers back to the app that identify the user. Now, Stefan is going to lead us over some of these details later. And the issue of all these, as a summary, is that none of these platforms can actually natively enforce Carta or actually zero trust framework. So all that greatness that I showed you before, that we described before, around conditions, controls, adaptive access, being able to actually monitor in real-time session risk of users or devices, it is not available for these tools because they are legacy, because many of the providers of these tools haven't updated them, and so companies are looking to how to improve this.
Definitely. And let's jump into a time machine, which goes back 31 years to 1990. Because actually back then, if you look into what we're talking about, Azure AD being the control plane in the middle, connecting everything, back then, people were also looking for something like that. But with all the security measures that we have today, they weren't available back then. So web access management is that started in 1990, and some known examples are SiteMinder from Symantec, from Broadcom nowadays, Oracle Access Managers. And how it would work is it depended a bit on the implementation, and that's what also makes it a bit complex, right? You have the option to implement agents, to use a proxy, or do something with tokens, something we do nowadays as well. And that means that it requires a lot of high-end hardware and infrastructure, because it's going to be the middle, it's going to be the thing that people see first when they're trying to access an application. So it would require multiple servers. Think about storing logs, storing directory servers, which would lead into a high maintenance cost around that solution. But also think about the limitations that are there. For example, one of them is that most of it is end of life. If you would search for Symantec SiteMinder on the Broadcom website, you will only find a small patch that they did, and that's basically almost announcing the end of these services, which also means that there's no innovation. And it leads us to a lot of limitations for those web application management systems. First of all, as it is a lot of servers that are working together, it also requires you to set up some high availability, which, if you look at Azure AD from a cloud scale, has it built in. And this would require you to deploy multiple servers to make sure that service is up and running, have procedures in place to make sure that it's high available. Think about unexpected loads. You would see this SiteMinder tools or web access management tools being used also for consumer-facing applications. And maybe you are a shop and you have a great sale on stuff, and then suddenly you have an expected load, which basically means that I need to roll in real physical servers to upgrade that. And I think the important piece where Javier showed you the beauty of conditional access and the beauty of going from conditional access to a zero trust type of infrastructure, these type of apps are not prepared for those type of security things. Think about using username and password and limited multi-factor authentication. Those things are not there. So when we looked into that, and we've seen this becoming a bigger and bigger problem at customers, and they're struggling with it because it is a lot of core apps that are still using this framework. So you need to keep it running, but you also need to keep it protected, and you need to think about costs and cost savings. And this is where we started to look into what we call secure hybrid access. And secure hybrid access, it's not one thing. It's what we call a program. It contains a lot of things that could make your life a lot easier around these web access management or WAM type of applications. So part of our secure hybrid access story at the core is basically Azure AD App Proxy. And Azure AD App Proxy provides remote access to on-premises applications, but also other clouds. So if you remember that slide that tells about conditional access, you would also see the Google Cloud and AWS. It doesn't matter where the application is running, we can connect it. And what Azure AD App Proxy also does is making that conversion. So it can talk a modern protocol that support all those security features, that support modern authentication, and is hosted in a cloud situation which can scale and doesn't require you to think about high availability. And it can, on the other end, talk header-based authentication. So you can make that conversion there, and you can connect that app that you currently have connected with SiteMinder to a system that is way more cost efficient and also that is high available, scalable, but also adds that protection there. And there are some other things that we can do with App Proxy, on-premises SAML apps or Kerberos or remote desktop. And we can even do that with per app conditional access. But we didn't want to stop there because there's a few things that we see is that those are not the only use cases if it comes to protecting those on-premises apps. Think about things like SSH type of applications or maybe some very advanced scenarios that are there. And that's where we partner with, for example, F5 and Akamai and Strata and Cisco and Citrix to make this a full story. And this also enables you, if you already made that investment in Citrix or in Akamai, F5, or one of the other partners, you can leverage that investment and connect it to Azure AD and get all that security in place. And think about it, secure hybrid access is more than remote access. We did a study back in August 2020 looking at the cost savings of using secure hybrid access. And we're seeing a 123% return on investment when you connect an app to Azure AD. A 50% reduction in overall management efforts for an IAM team because you take away all that complexity of running those high available servers and leave that up to the cloud. Also a reduction of 45% in the likelihood of a data breach. So think about adding MFA, adding those conditional access controls, and a 100% cost saving by eliminating that on-premises infrastructure. Because now we're talking about migrating your app to that infrastructure. But after you migrate it, you can just pull the plug. You don't need to pay for those very expensive support contracts for legacy technology, and you don't need to have all those servers up and running. Okay, so let's have a look. We already mentioned Azure AD Application Proxy, and one thing we recently added to Azure AD Application Proxy is the header-based authentication. So don't want to go into too much detail, but what we basically did here is giving Azure AD the ability to talk the same language as those web access management platforms. It means that maybe now you have deployed all kinds of proxy services from SiteMinder, and you can remove that proxy service and have this application proxy service in place and add security from an Azure AD perspective. So this is something that is generally available today with Azure AD App Proxy. But as I mentioned, there are probably more scenarios that you're looking at protecting those on-premises applications. And that's where the partners come in, and our new partners that we have announced during last Ignite, basically extending that secure hybrid access story. And we're continuously looking for new partners and adding new partners to that partnership, making sure, first of all, that you can leverage your current investment and your current relationship with that partner, but also giving you the option that if you're looking at Azure AD application proxy and it's not going to cover all the requirements that you have from your current WAM system, we have different options there. Talking about requirements, so we've created a white paper, and I will share the link later on during the session, looking at current WAM requirements and mapping them to our secure hybrid access story. So what we've seen working with customers and working with partners who did those type of implementations, we looked at, well, what are the common WAM requirements? So things like step-up authentication or authorization mapping, impersonation authorization or fine-grained authorization are things that are common WAM requirements. And what we did there is that we built a decision chart for you as a customer, which would make it easier to see which options are there available. So this decision chart is made before we announced the new partnerships. So partners like Strada are not in this chart yet, but are going to be added in the future. So look, for example, if I need a HTTP header integration, I have a whole list of integrations that I can pick from. I can use the native Azure AD App Proxy integration, or I can work with partners like Citrix F5 and Akamai. And if you look at those other partners as well that are there, we do have a full comparison chart looking at all those protocols. So this is around the header-based piece where we're looking at what do you need to replace your WAM platform? And this is looking even a step further. Maybe you have an LDAP source on-prem, maybe you have a Kerberos app on-prem, and you can see which partners are available that you can use to replace that on-premises structure. So this would be the first step to look at when you look at setting up a project, looking at your applications and seeing how can we modernize and protect those applications that are there. And we're talking about how an average project would look later on during this session. But there are other options as well for those apps to modernize.
Yeah, I mean, the one that we need to talk first is about the fact that there is a gallery on Azure AD that contains a set of pre-built integrations with feature apps like AWS or SAP. So going back to what we were discussing at the beginning, that between 60 and 80% of the apps are still what we will call legacy, right? And a good number of them might be SAP or ERP systems. Then one of the questions that you need to go through is that what is going to be the effort to actually modernize that app, or potentially go into a model in where the app actually can switch and move from using HTTP headers and use SAML. Because if that's the case, then you can look into the pre-built integration that we have on the Azure AD Gallery, where we have a lot of apps that already support modern protocols like SAML, WSFET, OpenID, and OAuth, and that integration actually not only will enable single sign-on or like things like applying security or adaptive access controls, but actually some of these ones even enable some additional scenarios, like even, for example, user provision, right? Which is something that we haven't discussed, which is a scheme, right? So being able to support providing information about the users from the IDP to the service provider, and actually on the fly or in a scheduled time, provision those accounts as they get assigned to get access. So in this gallery, there are over 3,000 applications, and they're different type of apps based on what the service provider supports, if they support SAML, WSFED, or actually some of them also are what we call password-based SSO, which basically means that actually just saves the user a password, and then using a plugin injects them when you're trying to access the app. And what this is all doing is basically simplifying the user experience, right? So we don't consider necessarily that one the most secure way to do it, or the best one, the best way to do it. But you will encounter that there are certain applications in which that could be the way to solve the problem. When you look for modernizing, or when you look for alternative apps, or when you look for newer versions of the apps that actually include support for the modern ones. Now, if it's not on the gallery, you also can integrate them, because there are templates to actually onboard applications that are not on the gallery. But if you're looking to create or also make sure that as the application gets on the gallery, it also supports some of these advanced scenarios I described, like user provisioning, there is a way for us to basically open for you customers, for anyone, to request new application integrations, right? So nothing is stopping you, literally, if the support is there from a protocol perspective, to do it yourself. But if you want the app to be in the gallery, and then also you want to build other integrations like a scheme, then you can reach out to our team, to the Identity Engineering Division, through the links that you see there, where basically you're going to submit a request for an application integration. It depends if you're an ISV or a customer, the process will be slightly different. But anyways, at the end, the goal is for members of our team to work with the ISV, to work with the customer, to make sure that we can test out the integration, that we can set up the federation, that we can try or we can test what are the right claims that the app needs to receive, that we can also can document what is the configuration that needs to happen on the service provider side. And if we can enable things like user provision, or if we can enable things like one-click SSO, which is a feature that basically allows to automate all the setup on the service provider side, then we will do it. That way, we are also enabling some advanced use cases as well on the customer side. Now, how that's possible? Well, that's possible because Microsoft has built Azure AD based on open standards. Open standards that probably the most common one known out there is SAML 2.0. The majority of the SaaS applications out there are actually using SAML 2.0. Now, what we have seen is that applications are, especially composite applications that are multi-level, like client app, and then a front-end API, and then back-end APIs, actually are switching to use Open ID and OAuth because of the flexibility and the multiple credential flows that they do have. And then we have things like FIDO Alliance, which is about how we can actually not only deliver a better experience for users when accessing application using passwordless, but also make it more secure, right? On top of that, there are other things like supporting token binding or scheme, which is a provisioning protocol, or standard data formats. All applications that are being built right now use these frameworks or uses the standards, and it will be possible for them to integrate. Now, if a customer is also building, if one of you is also building applications yourself, the idea is that your developer teams should actually be able to leverage these frameworks. And additionally, what we have is that as part of that effort, and related to, I do have this line of business apps or legacy, can I actually look to modernize them? We want to make this easy for customers. So not only there is a protocol support, right? There is also libraries and SDKs that we have available that actually make this simpler for developer teams. If you own the application, if you have the code of those legacy apps that are using HTTP headers, then you might look to actually replace portions of the code by using our libraries, and make sure that now your app can natively use Azure AD, in which case you will not longer need not only application proxy, but you also as well will not longer need anything like F5 or any of the other partners, because the app can connect directly to Azure AD. App proxy or the partners are there because if you cannot modernize the application, then they basically become the broker for using modern authentication, applying all the modern controls, all the security controls that we have described, and then passing back to the app whatever the app support. In this case, for example, let's assume that it's an HTTP header, but it might be as well, for example, like Kerberos token, right? So the idea is that these libraries and these SDKs are there to help your developing teams, if you own the apps, to make the transition. And we do have some guidance in terms of, what if the app is using a specific developing platform, a specific coding, what could be the way to actually take that app and make sure that can actually take advantage of using Azure AD and using Azure AD credentials. So what to do to bring an application under the protection of Azure AD? I mentioned already that you might look first to see if it's on the gallery. If it's on the gallery, you can use one of the custom templates that we have, which is like any SAML app, any OIDC, OpenID application, or auth application. If you want, also you can submit, or ISVs can submit a request for the application to be published on the gallery. And as we do that, then what happens is that we can enable those advanced scenarios. One click is one of them that I just described before, basically the idea of avoiding all the setup that needs to happen on the service provider side. In this case, it depends on the app, but basically you put some API endpoints, the credentials, admin credentials, and then Azure configures everything on that application. Then the other option is to modernize the Auth stack. Going back to my point before around, do you own the app? Do you have the code? Then you can use our SDKs and use our authentication libraries, ADAL or MSHOL, and then use a graph, and then transition these apps into modern authentication. If you have ADFS, which also might be the case, and some of these legacy apps are using ADFS, there are tools that we have also as well available, and guidance that we have available around how to perform a migration of apps from ADFS to Azure AD. And then there's an ecosystem of partners that actually are there to help you through the modernization, to help you through the migration of ADFS, to help you through the adoption of some modern technologies like Microsoft Services identities, or how to use containers, or how to use the Vault, especially if you need to actually use secrets inside of your code. So I would strongly recommend to actually look at these partners. And then lastly, the other option is, so if it's not on the gallery, if you cannot modernize the app, or the effort to modernize the app might be actually too big, especially because we might be talking about hundreds of applications. Actually, that's what the data show us, that most of these customers have hundreds of applications of this type. Then your option is going to basically use a proxy, or use one of our delivery controller integrations like Citrix, Akamai, and any of the others, in order to be able to still benefit of passwordless, still benefit of all these modern security controls that Azure AD provides, but at the same way still support whatever that application needs from an authorization perspective. And in that case, it will be a proxy, or as I mentioned already, any of these integration vendors or network delivery controllers. Lastly, I guess that the other option is always to build a new application and then just basically replace down the road. I think that at any point, the majority of enterprises, it depends, will actually combine or use a combination of all these four options, right? You might encounter new versions that are on the SaaS app, on the SaaS gallery, then you might actually look to modernize some of your apps. Some others that you're waiting to retire, then you can do through a proxy or network delivery controllers. And in the meantime, you're actually building these new versions of the apps that use SAML or IDC OAuth.
And one thing I want to point out is that Microsoft identity is built, is identity from Microsoft, not only for Microsoft. So it doesn't really matter where your application is running. If it's still on premises, or if it's running on Azure, or any other cloud, or any other infrastructure that you want to run it, all the goodness that we just talked about, it doesn't look at the location where it's running. So, for example, if you would run it on AWS or Azure or the Google Cloud, we can connect to that using the technology that we just described. We can use App Proxy, but we also can leverage Azure Arc for any on-premise or multi-cloud environment to connect all those applications to Azure AD and making that control plane and adding that protection, so that multi-factor authentication, that conditional access, that can all be added to any application, doesn't matter where it's actually running. So we looked at the options that are available to take that legacy app and modernize it and move it maybe to a different location, and saving cost and adding protection. But how would such an app migration look? from a project perspective. So first of all, how we see it in a typical app migration project is that you have 5 phases. So you're basically starting with the discovery phase, where you're going to look what are the apps that I have available and how and make a list of those apps, and also, for example, look at who are the app owners, and you can also make app usage part of that process, which can help you in the next step. And the next step would be to classify those apps. So look into which app should I move first, and which app where I may want to wait, which would be a complex one, or which one I want to replace, and which type of mechanism I want to use. So classify could be, instead of using app proxy or using one of our partners, I maybe can modernize this app. Or even though this app is now connected to a WEM system, it does support SAML. So I could connect it directly to Azure AD and add that protection and add that control plane to that application. Then the last piece would be, or the middle piece would be migrate. Then you need to look into managing, logging, all those type of things around that app. In the end, the beautiful day has arrived to pull the plug and cut off that whole system. But if you look at those different phases, it's the most important piece is actually that discover and classify piece, where we see from our experience that it's 80% planning and the executing is basically 20% of what we're doing. And this is where we see that we can help, especially on the planning piece, and when our partners can help on the execution piece. So let's have a look at what are the different things that you would do in such a phase. So let's zoom into the discovery and classify piece, because that is what we call the planning piece, right? We're looking into what are the applications, we're classifying which technology to use, and if we have everything clear and written down, we can execute, we can actually migrate them. So here are a few common tasks that are part of that piece. So if you look at the planning piece, discovery of apps, users policy, prioritize app migration to Azure AD, identify app usage, as I mentioned, and identify the app compatibility with Azure AD. And that's where we have those tools. For example, I was showing the decision chart, which can help you identify which technology should I use, or should I look into any of the partner solutions, the solutions that are there. So if you look at that planning phase, one of the key pieces that we have available is a white paper, which will talk you through all the things that we've seen with customers migrating those web access management applications, which is available at aka.ms/migrate-apps/SiteMinder. And if you would go to aka.ms/migrate-apps, you would also find a lot of information about how to migrate other apps, other types of apps that we discussed during this session. So this would be a typical migration, and also that white paper contains those phases and goes into detail around the things you need to think about. And the white paper is not only around technology, it's also around planning. So we're talking about which team should you involve with this migration, which piece of the migration, where should you get the buy-in, and which tools are there available to use. So let's have a look at what's next. So think about leveraging secure hybrid access published via app proxy or an app delivery controller as is. So look at your current WEM requirements. As I mentioned before, we have a whole list of requirements. You can plan for migration using the tools that are available at the URL mentioned. And you can decide on the components and if there's a partner needed that could help you move out of the current situation to a more modernized situation and connect to Azure AD. You can also look into replacing the app with a SaaS app, which is available in Azure AD. So this is one thing that I always mention to customers, is that it is a key thing to have a policy around which protocol to use for an application authentication when you're going to replace it. And this could be as the discovery part, right? We can look into those list of apps, we can talk to the app owner, and we could see, oh, maybe we already wanted to replace this app with a modern app. And as an identity person, you need to make sure that they pick an application that support things like OpenID Connect or OAuth 2.0, which are also the protocols that we within Microsoft are standardizing on if it comes to the identity piece. Of course, SAML is also nice to have, but I would definitely focus on OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 as it has multiple advantages over SAML. And then if you're building a new app and you want to add it to Azure AD, think about what we call the Microsoft Authentication Library. And this is what Javier talked about earlier. We have an SDK available that you can use in your app. And it's basically only 3 lines of code that are needed to connect that application to Azure AD. But you can also use it with a current app. If you do have the option to add that SDK, it could be a very easy way of adding modern authentication to this application. And also make sure that you add that protection which comes with Azure AD. Okay, we have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A.
Let's
For
see.
now, yeah.
Meanwhile, the questions come, I guess that one question that I want to hear to your perspective, Stefan, is to what you can share. I would say that when you go through that flow, where in some cases a proxy was an option and in others wasn't, the question that I always get from customers is like, is at any point going to be Microsoft an option for all those different requirements, right? So it's like, can I think in the future in a state in where a proxy can actually be used across, right? So if I need to do authorization mapping, or if I need to do fine-grained authorization for those HTTP headers apps, is that something that a proxy will be able to help on?
That's a great question, and definitely those are things that we're looking at. We're always looking into adding capabilities to app proxy and improving those, improving that technology. So what you said, if you look at this chart, where, for example, the authorization mapping or fine-grained authorization pieces are not leading to the Azure AD app proxy, those are for us focus areas to look at on how can we provide also a native solution to provide these type of capabilities. But still keeping in mind that the partner solutions that we have are not only there for if you need that requirement. They're also there if you already using that partner solution and want to leverage your current investment. So things will always exist next to app proxy as it is evolving and as we are adding more features to app proxy. So definitely something that we're looking at.
All right. And I see a question about, is there any difference between, any fundamental difference, right? In case that there is, I guess. Is there any difference between these partners in terms of, like, I guess that the question is deployment models or how they work? Is there anything that we can highlight, or they're all the same?
No, there's definitely a difference. So depending on the partner, they offering a full cloud solution. For example, if you look at the Zscaler solution, where they're also working just like app proxy with a lightweight agent that you install, but all the magic will happen on the cloud side. Where with a product like F5 or with Citrix, you also have those appliances that are available that has all the intelligence baked into that appliance. So yeah, there are differences depending on your requirements on what type of technology you want to use, and also in what do you need to deploy and what do you need to manage to put in place this partner solution.
Okay. All right. I think that this other question is related, like, do I need to change anything on the app if I use any of these partners, or even a proxy? I would say probably, right? So, like, do we need to change, or customers need to change anything on the apps?
Most of the time, there are no changes required. So basically, this will act as a translator. So the app now talks that WAM language, and what we will do is talk that language on one side, and on the other side, we're talking that modern language, which support all those protections things that are in place. So most of the time, and of course, it also depends on the apps and the requirements. If you look at that requirement matrix that is there, that if maybe a change is needed, but most of the time there's no change needed to the app. I can just pick it and I can even say, okay, let's grab this app and put it in Azure, run it there, and then put the app proxy or put one of our partners in front to add that modern authentication without changing that app at all. So yeah, that's a great question. Okay, one question I want to ask the people attending if they would provide their feedback. So the URL is also posted, but you can find it on the screen. Happy to learn from you what you thought of this session and any feedback. One other thing I want to point out is if you want to learn more about secure hybrid access, go to aka.ms/secure-hybrid-access, and you'll find everything around secure hybrid access in our documentation. And if you are on Twitter, feel free to follow our accounts. And I think with that, feel free to drop some questions. I will monitor the Q&A as well to make sure to answer your questions. And with that, I want to thank you for joining. And thanks, Javier.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think it's a question that always comes, licensing, right? So is there any licensing that is required here?
That's a good question. So if you look at Azure AD application proxy, that would require an Azure AD Premium P1 license. If you look at the partner solutions, it of course depends on the partner. So if I would for example use Strata, they have their own licensing model next to Azure AD. That's needed. Conditional access, which is the feature that we talked about at the beginning, and MFA are also all part of Azure AD Premium P1. So yeah.
Yeah, and now you remind me. So I guess that one of the points there, as we were describing, right, is that we want customers to leverage their current investments, right? So
Yep.
I mean, you might look to procure one of these technologies, right? But the idea of actually supporting that many is that you at least should have one of them, right? So it shouldn't mean additional licensing on top of what you're doing with Azure AD,
Yep.
because you already have that product, right?
Yep.
And probably the one that is kind of an exception to all that, I did remember, is PIN, right? So with PIN, and specifically their PIN access product, there is actually a benefit via partnership between the two companies, in where if you get Azure AD Premium, then you can get a special version of PIN that actually supports up to 20 applications, right?
That's correct.
So that way, again, depends on the number of apps. That might mean that you don't need any more licensing, or yes, right? So just do remember about that one, which is kind of
definitely a good point. One of the hidden benefits of Azure AD Premium P1. I think if you look at it, all the things we talked about today, and benefiting from that, from the Azure AD license requirement piece, you're talking about Azure AD Premium P1, which will cover all the things from the Azure AD side that we talked about, and of course what you said, the 20 apps you will get with Ping Access and the integration there as well is part of that license.
There is also a question that I see around if the deck is going to be available to attendees. So
yep, the deck will be available after the session and will be sent out to all the attendees, including the recording, if you want to rewatch it or share it with anyone that would be available. Yes. So okay, awesome. Then I think thank you.
Thank you very much.
And have a great day.